In a lot of what we've talked about with regard to the American response, we've talked primarily about things that were happening in LA. When we talked about folk rock, we talked about a lot of artists that had started in the New York Greenwich Village scene but sort of migrated to LA. So it's easy to get the impression that almost everything that was important that was happening as part of the American response was happening in Los Angeles. And while there was certainly a lot of significant stuff coming out of LA, it wasn't the only thing going on during those days, and it wasn't the only part of the American response. We said before that a lot of artists continued to have success both before and after the arrival of the Beatles in February of 1964. And some of you may have wondered why I haven't already mentioned Frankie Valli and the Four Seasons. Well, talking about Frankie Valli and the Four Seasons brings us back now to the East Coast, to the New York, New Jersey area, to New York as an entertainment center, and some of the music that was coming out of that part of the country. And so that's what we'll talk about in this video. Well, let's talk about Frankie Valli and the Four Seasons. Of course, made popular in the most recent years by the musical Jersey Boys, right? Frankie Valli and the Four Seasons had big hits in 1962. #1 hits with Sherry and Big Girls Don't Cry. In this period that we're talking about during the British invasion, they continue to have hits. Let's Hang On was a #4 hit for them in 1965, and Working My Way Back to You was a #9 hit in 1966. So during this entire period between before the Beatles, going back to 62, and then going all the way forward to 66, we can see Frankie Valli and the Four Seasons having tremendous success. For me, anyways, it's interesting that we have a kind of what you might think of as a West Coast falsetto and an East Coast falsetto. On the West Coast, that sort of falsetto, that high male voice where you flip into the high part of your voice, that's a very big part of the Beach Boys sound, with Brian Wilson being the high falsetto in a lot of those Beach Boys surf music records and even the ambitious surf music that we start to get in the mid-1960s. Frankie Valli, a kind of a different sounding falsetto voice, maybe a little bit more raspy, but still, when we think about the Beach Boys and Frankie Valli and the Four Seasons, we have really groups that in a lot of ways are essentially are similar in a number of sort of essential ways, one representing the West Coast and the other representing the East Coast. Also, with Frankie Valli and with the Four Seasons and what was happening with them during the British invasion, you remember that when we're talking about the Beatles, we said the first couple singles they had, they couldn't get released by Capitol Records. Capitol Records just did not believe that Americans would be interested in a British group. And so the 3 of those singles were released on VJ Records, an indie label out of Chicago. And VJ also had most of the material from the first Beatles British album. And so interestingly, the Beatles were in the position where when they broke in February, they had albums that were #1 and 2 on the charts, but on different labels, one on Capitol and one on VJ. Well, after things started to cool a little bit with that material that VJ owned, they also had Frankie Valli and the Four Seasons. And so there's an album that collectors, that's really big with collectors, called, I think it's called The Beatles versus the Four Seasons, which was released in late 1964, which featured a lot of the Beatles stuff that VJ had licensed, plus the sort of greatest hits package of the Four Seasons. And so even VJ was trying to take advantage not only of the fact that they had Frankie Valli and the Four Seasons, but that they had this Beatles music, and so you see this interaction between these two groups occurring. Also in New York, we should talk about the Lovin' Spoonful. There's a situation of folkies from the Greenwich Village scene who didn't go to LA, but who rather stayed in New York City and made their careers there. John Sebastian, the lead singer, songwriter, and interestingly enough, one of the few examples of rock and roll auto harp. If you check out those videos on the internet somewhere, you'll see him singing and playing an auto harp, which was actually a kind of a harp that had little sort of chord presets on it. So if you push down a button, you'd get a C major chord or an A minor chord. And these were used a lot by people in the public schools to sort of accompany kids while they sang folk songs. You didn't have to learn how to play the guitar. You just sort of pushed the different buttons down for the chords and you could accompany. And so there's John Sebastian. Their big song, probably their big breakout song, was Do You Believe in Magic, a #9 hit in the summer of '65, the same time as we're getting Like a Rolling Stone and Mr. Tambourine Man. And then in 1966, a #2 hit with Daydream, in addition to a bunch of other hits. Now, the Lovin' Spoonful projected a kind of an upbeat image. You hear a lot of the sort of jug band influences. Jug band, a kind of a folk, sort of amateurish folk style. is sort of a populist kind of style, and you hear a lot of that sort of a good time music happen in the Love and Spoonful. Another group from the New York area was the Rascals, and in a minute we'll talk about Paul Revere and the Raiders and the way they wore Revolutionary War garb as part of their sort of stage uniform. Well, the Rascals started out as the Young Rascals, wearing outfits that looked an awful lot like the Little Rascals, who had been part of a movie series, a series of movie shorts and episodes that had played earlier in, I suppose it was the 30s and the 40s. So anyway, they called themselves the Young Rascals, but I guess that kind of got tired of that issue and they just became the Rascals. But their influence was far less in pop and vocal-oriented music than it was with blues roots. So if you think about maybe the Byrds being the answer to the Beatles, the Rascals would kind of be the answer to the Spencer Davis Group, maybe, or I don't know, the Animals, or to a certain extent the Rolling Stones, although the Rolling Stones were a little bit more song-oriented. In fact, the Rascals opened for the Beatles at that famous Shea Stadium concert in 1965, featuring Felix Cavallari on the organ and Eddie Brigandi on vocals. Those two guys often wrote songs together. Big hit for them came in the spring of 1966, Good Lovin', which still gets a lot of airplay. That was their cover of an R&B hit for a group called the Olympics from 1965. And then right in the middle of this, the beginning of the psychedelic era, Groovin' was a #1 hit for them in 1967. Lots of other music there. Finally, let's talk about a group that started out in Indiana. This group was called the McCoys and featured Rick Derringer on the guitar. Now, Rick Derringer would later become important for playing with the Edgar Winter Group and then having his own solo career in the 70s. But at this point, he and the rest of the guys in his band are young. I mean young, like under 18 young. So young that when they have a hit, a #1 hit in 1965 with a tune called Hang On Sloopy, they can't tour until spring break from high school because they can't cut classes to go out and tour, right? And so we're talking about really, really young guys. They were produced by a fellow named Burt Burns, who had worked for Atlantic Records and had picked up production of the Drifters after Leiber and Stoller left off. So he was already producing groups, and his sort of Beatles-ish group, American Response Group, was going to be the McCoys. And as I say, they had this big hit in 1965 with Hang On Sloopy, which was, for all intents and purposes, a kind of a reworking of the song Louie Louie. We'll talk about Louie Louie in the next video coming up here. Interestingly, Burt Burns, as I said, Rick Derringer went on after the McCoys to have his own career with Edgar Winter and as a solo artist. But Burt Burns went on to produce Neil Diamond on his first couple of singles, including Cherry Cherry, which was a hit for him and was a hit for Neil Diamond in 1966. Neil Diamond, as we'll mention a little bit later, also went on to, also as a songwriter, had a big hit in '66 with the Monkees, a song called I'm a Believer. So in the next video, let's turn to garage bands. I've already mentioned Louie Louie, and let's see what was happening with young kids influenced by the Beatles, picking up guitars and playing music in basements and garages all across this country in the middle of the 1960s.